This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Across the country, the way children are being taught to read is out of step with scientific research about the most effective techniques. That's the case being made in a new documentary from APM Reports Emily Hanford, and she joins us today. Emily, great to have you back.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
In some ways, this new documentary is a companion piece to a very provocative story you did last year on how schools are falling short on teaching students with dyslexia. Why did you want to take a closer look at how reading is taught across the board?
Doing that reporting last year on dyslexia was very eye-opening for me. I have been an education reporter for more than 10 years, and it was the moms, mostly the moms, of kids with dyslexia who pointed out to me what a problem there is with core reading instruction in many schools in America. So their kids with dyslexia are having a really hard time getting the help they need in school, and there are two big problems. One is that the kind of help that kids with dyslexia need is really what all kids need. Kids with dyslexia just need a really high dose of it. And the other problem is that a lot of teachers and educators, and it's not necessarily their fault, they weren't taught this themselves, but many of them don't know that much about how children learn to read. So kids with dyslexia, they're really struggling in school, but they're sort of the extreme example of what is happening. And it was these moms of dyslexic kids who really pointed that out to me. And many of them are really fighting on behalf of all of our kids. They've really figured out that all kids need something different, and they're fighting to change core reading instruction in addition to getting more help specifically for their children.
I always learn a lot from your reporting, and this was no exception. And one of the things I think we should talk about is that there are some things that are part of our evolutionary development, like walking and even talking, but reading isn't one of them. Explain that.
This is the really profound and important idea for people to understand. We've been fighting about reading for a long time, and it's because we really didn't, until relatively recently, know that much about how kids learn to read. So there were a lot of fights about how you should teach kids to read because not that much was known about how we really acquire this skill. And when you look at reading instruction in a lot of schools, what you will see is that the core kind of belief or understanding that motivates a lot of that instruction is that learning to read is essentially a natural process. Kids will basically learn to read if they're read to a lot, if you give them a lot of books, if you give them a little guidance. Some kids might need a little more teaching than others, but essentially it's something that happens naturally, kind of like learning to talk. And what reading scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists who've been doing all kinds of fascinating studies in labs and in classrooms over the past 30, 40 years, 50 years, what they've discovered, one of the main things they've discovered is that learning to read is not at all like learning to talk. Learning to talk is natural. Our brains are evolved to do it. If you talk to children, they will learn to talk unless they have some sort of cognitive problem, some sort of, serious impairment. But that's not true with reading. It is not natural. We are not born wired to read in the way that we are born wired to talk. It is something we need to learn, and it is something that in most cases needs to be taught.
So based on the science, what is the right way or the most effective way to teach reading? It involves phonics, right?
Absolutely. So phonics essentially means teaching children how letters and sounds correspond. So you want to see in a classroom, you want to see phonics instruction, which is really helping children learn those relationships. You also want to see phonemic awareness. So phonemic awareness is this really important skill that kids kind of need before and also continues to develop as they learn to read. But phonemic awareness is being able to identify and manipulate the speech sounds in words. So for example, if I say the word family, so the way that I say that word, family, if you think about how a kid would think to spell that word, they might spell it F-A-M-L-Y, family, right? So teachers really need to be explicitly helping children understand all the different sounds that are in that word. It's actually family, family. So you really want to have a lot of that. And in kindergarten and first and second grade, and in fact, I've heard people say that you can continue doing this kind of stuff up into third, fourth, and fifth grade. Phonemic awareness continues to develop. So what you want to see is teachers really spending a lot of time pronouncing words, making sure kids understand all the different sounds that are in the words, and then explicitly teaching them how different letters and combinations of letters represent those sounds. And it's really fascinating. If you go into a classroom and watch kids trying to spell, the way that I think about it is it's like this little window into what's going on in a kid's brain. Because when a kid is spelling a word, you think, well, that's wrong. Why is that wrong? And then if you have the kids say the word, you realize that they're often spelling it in terms of what they're hearing, but they really need help understanding that there are more sounds, there are more discrete sounds in that word. So you want to see a lot of both of those things going on in classrooms. But a really important point here is there's no evidence that phonics instruction is bad for kids, even kids who learn really easily. The research shows fast little readers become better spellers when you do phonics. And if you listen to what I just said about the importance of, phonemic awareness, think about that. I was just talking to a friend yesterday who's like, I was one of those people who learned how to read really easily, but I'm a horrible speller. And there are a lot of people who will say that to you. And these kinds of lessons early really develop spelling skills.
I want to emphasize this, that there is not a lot of dispute among scientists about this point, that this is how our brain learns to read and that we need this connection, the phonics, to make it happen.
There's no dispute among scientists. As one scientist put it in a book, it's not like scientists have figured out everything there is to know about reading. They're still learning stuff. There are disagreements about some things, but this basic fact that it is not natural, it's something we need to learn, and that phonics is key to learning it. That is in no dispute among scientists. There is no dispute about that.
But what you found and what you were able to show us and tell us in your documentary is that that's not what we're finding in most classrooms. Instead, what we're finding is what's now called balanced literacy, which I guess you could argue is rebranded whole language, in which reading is being taught almost, it seems like, by osmosis. If you have a lot of books out and pictures, kids will be naturally curious enough to try to figure things out, and that it's okay if they make mistakes along the way, if they can at least get the context of what they're reading. That's not as important as actually matching the letters and sounds. Is that about right?
Yeah, it's really tricky. So this idea of balanced literacy, it's a difficult thing for people to understand because it sounds really good. Who couldn't be for balanced literacy? And it is true at the end of the day that when it comes to reading, there are a lot of things that kids need to learn. There's a lot of balance in there. Phonics isn't the only thing that kids need to be able to become good readers. There are other components of reading. But this term balanced literacy is something to be very cautious about or suspicious of if you hear educators using that term when they describe their reading instruction, and you will find many, many schools that use that term. And you have to look at the history of the term itself. And essentially, balanced literacy was offered as a kind of truce to settle the reading wars.
So I encourage our listeners, if they want to know more about some of the history here in the fight over literacy, to listen to last year's companion piece about teaching students with dyslexia. But tell us, if you can, just sort of sum up some of that background.
So the reading wars were in the 80s and 90s, essentially, when there was all kinds of fighting about how kids learn to read. And there was really a sense by a lot of people who believed in what came to be known as whole language that phonics was bad. Kids didn't need phonics to learn to read, and that phonics might actually be kind of bad for kids. It would make them disinterested in learning. It would make the process of learning to read, which was, unlocking this world of wonderful literature and books, that if you focused on these skills about how to break words down, that it would be tedious, and that kids who were ahead would be stuck, and they would be bored, and kids would be confused, and it would be harder for kids to learn to read with phonics. That was really the belief. All this science was done, and it was really shown definitively, as I said before, that that's not true, that phonics is absolutely essential to unlocking reading for kids. And balanced literacy was really offered as a kind of truce to say, okay, well, we'll do a little bit of both. We'll do some phonics, and we'll still kind of hold on to a lot of these things that we've already been doing that are steeped in these beliefs that's surrounding kids with good books and just giving them a little bit of guidance and letting them kind of take off into the world of literature, that's the way that kids really ultimately learn to read, and we should be doing that. So when you go into a balanced literacy classroom, and they vary, it's not like there's one definition for this term. There may be some schools that call themselves balanced literacy that are doing a fantastic job with phonics, but there's a lot of evidence that a lot of schools that use this term, they are not doing a good job. They're either doing not enough phonics or they're really not approaching phonics in the right way.
We're talking with Emily Hanford of APM Reports about her new documentary, Hard Words, Why Aren't Our Kids Being Taught to Read? This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. CZI believes that every child should enter adulthood able to recognize and realize their full potential, and that a whole child approach to personalized learning is the most promising way to achieve this vision. Visit chanzuckerberg.com/education for more information. EWA retains all editorial control over programming and content. Well, let's take a step and take a look at the folks who are actually responsible for delivering this instruction. Certainly, teachers aren't making it up as they go. They've been told and taught the approach they need to take in their classroom, and sometimes even set down by district policy. If I'm a brand new student at my local teachers' college, what's my training going to look like when it comes to teaching reading? How am I being taught?
So it's important to say at the outset that there's a lot of variation and that there's not like one study that's been done that says like this is how teacher prep programs are teaching reading. There are some teacher prep programs where there's some evidence that they're doing a really good job. But there are a number of studies and surveys of what's being done in teacher prep programs that indicate that the status quo in teacher prep programs in America is not very good when it comes to really steeping prospective teachers in the science of how kids learn to read and in the importance of phonics, the kind of phonics they should be teaching, and how to really do that. Part of it has to do with a sort of ignorance and resistance to some of the science among some of the faculty in higher education. And I think it also ties into a larger problem we have with teacher training in this country. Teacher training has been critiqued and criticized for many years for not really being hands-on enough. And I've interviewed a lot of teachers at this point who have come out of their teacher preparation programs frustrated by feeling like they didn't get a lot of really good hands-on guidance on exactly what to do, and have specifically really learned little to nothing about how to really teach reading.
Well, it's an awesome responsibility, to be sure. And there's an interesting moment in your piece that stuck with me when they talk about the phonics instruction being a lot of repetition and being, sometimes considered a little bit boring. But then I thought about it and I thought, who is it really boring for? And I realized, it's probably boring for the adult who have to carry it out. But really, that's not the end game here, is it?
Exactly. I mean, I think this whole issue of how phonics there's sort of an allergy to too much phonics in a lot of schools, and how that came to be is a fascinating question. I think there is some tedious and not very good phonics instruction out there. So that's not, not real. But I think you make an important point that it may seem that way to the adults, but to little kids who are learning how to read, if you can really give them good instruction and these tools about how to learn to read, it's exciting to learn how to read. And in fact, the research suggests that is what you want to see a lot of in classrooms, that teaching children explicitly and systematically how words work is what you want to do starting when kids are in kindergarten. And there's a whole other body of research that's not connected specifically to reading that shows that explicit instruction, direct explicit instruction, really works.
I want to turn for a moment to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where you found a renewed emphasis on phonics was having a marked impact on children's reading skills in the lower grades. What did you find there?
So it's a story about a school district that saw that a whole lot of their kids weren't reading proficiently, about 40%, and across the nation it's even worse than that, actually. And it just happened to be a person who was in charge there who said, well, wait a minute, why do we have so many kids who aren't reading well? And he really didn't know very much about how kids learn to read, so he started Googling it, and you can find this research pretty easily. I mean, I cannot emphasize enough how vast the scientific literature is on how children learn to read and how they should be taught and how important phonics is. So this guy, Jack Silva, got together with his colleagues and said, I think we should be able to solve this problem because there's all this research that actually says pretty much most kids can learn how to read. We shouldn't have so many kids struggling. And so they started a multi-year, multi-million-dollar plan to try to change reading instruction in their district. And they're not done yet, but they've had a very big impact already on the reading scores in kindergarten. They have practically doubled the number of kids who are going into first grade on track to become successful readers.
There's a moment in your piece where the folks who don't agree with the scientific research that's out there about the value and importance of phonics are compared to those who won't accept the science of climate change. And I found that to be a pretty dramatic statement.
I've been now talking to people about this and reading about this for almost 2 years, and I think it's a really apt comparison. This information about how children learn to read and how they should be taught is definitive, and it's been around for a long time. And it's not having nearly as much impact on what is actually happening in schools as it should. And as you hear in the piece, there are people, teachers, and I think maybe more in teacher education, teacher preparation, who still really believe in old ideas that have been disproven by science over and over, but they believe in old ideas about how kids learn to read, and they teach teachers those ideas. And teachers go into schools not knowing much about how kids learn to read or really being misinformed about how kids learn to read.
So, Emily, who has the power here? Let's say that this premise is exactly spot on, that the science is there and people just aren't following it. If I'm an education reporter, who am I asking, why aren't you following this or at least considering it? Is it school boards, the State Board of Education, the state legislature? Is it the accrediting committees who oversee state teacher colleges?
All those people, Emily. And I think this is a difficult thing to figure out how to fix. You can actually see in a lot of states have passed various kinds of laws that are sort of digging around at the edges of this problem and trying to change things. And I don't know how well those mandates from above work. I mean, I think there's a place for them, and I think it's kind of like a push and pull. Like, I think the people in charge need to force things in certain ways, but I also think ultimately this is about education. This is about teaching teachers and teaching teacher educators about the science. And that's a really heavy lift, but the optimistic part of this for me is that especially when you talk to teachers, the millions of people who are in classrooms teaching kids every day, from the people I have directly talked to and from others who are doing this work trying to train teachers on the science of reading, across the board, what you find is that teachers are desperate for this information because a lot of them have had that feeling in the pit of their stomach for a long time, like, I don't know if this is really working for a lot of the kids. Like, they've had struggling readers and they've tried things, and for a lot of them, what they were trying wasn't working. And when you introduce them to these ideas, and especially when you show them how to teach this way, how to use these ideas, they're so relieved and grateful, and then sometimes they're kind of angry, like, why didn't anyone teach this to me before? So I think it's a really important point to keep in mind here. This isn't teachers' fault, and we shouldn't be blaming them. It really is more about the districts and the fact that they really need to be bringing in professional development to teach this to teachers, and then it's about teacher preparation. And I do think teacher preparation needs to be held accountable by the lawmakers who ultimately are the ones who are approving and accrediting their programs, and there may need to be some force there.
So there's some statistics in your piece that I encourage education reporters to take a close look at and to use as springboards for their own reporting. Among them, that more than 6 in 10 fourth graders in the U.S. are not proficient readers. 30 million adults have trouble reading a basic passage of text. And then you also emphasize in your piece that this is not just about kids who are in poverty, and that about a third of struggling readers actually come from college-educated families.
And this is how the parents of dyslexic kids have really made such a big difference here because, for better or worse, a lot of the dyslexia advocates are fairly affluent moms in quote-unquote good school districts who have resources and money, and their kids grew up being read to all the time, and they have college-educated parents, and they still weren't reading. And so we have this kind of narrative in this country that the reason that we have a problem with reading is we have so much poverty. It must be connected to poverty. And it's not unconnected to poverty. Poverty has an impact on how well kids read. But poverty is not the answer here. And it's when people who are not poor and who are well educated and who have done everything quote unquote right when it comes to surrounding their kids with good books and their kids still can't read, that number one reveals that their child has a real problem. They're like, they've got something going on in their own brain that's making reading really difficult. But it's also clued into this isn't the answer. It's surrounding kids with books and reading to them. Those are really, really important and great things to do. But the point I make in the documentary is it is not the same thing as teaching children to read.
Emily Hanford is an award-winning journalist and a senior producer and correspondent for APM Reports. Emily, thank you for making time for EWA Radio.
I'm really happy to do it. Thanks for your interest.
And thank you, everybody. That wraps up another episode for us. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.